Thanks for staying around. My name is Gary Aho. I'm the Executive Director of the National Oil Shale Association. We're headquartered out of Colorado, but a good share of our members are here in Utah. What I want to talk today about is a new U.S. oil shale opportunity. I guess this is why I advance slides. U.S. oil shale opportunity. Oil shale was first discovered in the United States, particularly in the Piceance Creek Basin of Colorado and also in Uintah Basin about 1912. There was a rush of development in that period of time because we were running out of oil in the United States and we were in World War II and needed alternate supplies of fuel. So there was a land rush to the western states to develop oil shale. There was a number of pilot plants built, demonstration plants built, in Colorado and actually in Utah, down along the White River. Remnants of those plants can still be found. I wrote the history of the Utah oil shale industry a couple of years ago. It was published by the Utah Geological Survey as part of the Uintah Basin field guide. So if you want to read up on some of the history, it's written up there. And despite the 100-year history now that we've had in oil shale, we're still not producing anything in the basins here in the United States. Shale oil is being produced in other parts of the world, Estonia, Brazil, China, and we're still pushing forward in the United States, and that's one of the goals of the Oil Shale Association, is to kind of foster the development of shale, not lose the expertise that we've had developed over the last 40, 50 years. Oil shale is kind of like the white elephant in the room, the white energy elephant or the energy elephant. I listened to that opening panel discussion last night, listened all day long. I think I'm the only one that ever mentioned oil shale, yet it's such a huge resource here in the Uintah Basin, in the Piceance Creek Basins of Colorado. So I'm going to give a little bit of what we're trying to do with the association, an update, and tell you now what's happening in the oil shale industry here in the United States. Outline is going to be what is the National Oil Shale Association, which oil shale are we talking about, Utah industry status, a little bit about our current proposal. We call it the white paper that was written by the National Oil Shale Association and released in May of this year. We've been introducing it to Washington, D.C., trying to get some action and maintain some level of activity in shale, some of the advocacy activities, and then my final wrap-up. The National Oil Shale Association, we're a not-for-profit group. Our objective and goal is education. We're not a lobbying organization per se. We'd like to see that oil shales developed in a responsible manner to the benefit of the long-term domestic energy security of the nation. We say which oil shale. Right now you hear so much about shale oil being produced by horizontal drilling and fracking, and most of that's being done in other parts of the country, particularly shale oil in North Dakota, the Basin, the Permian Basin, eastern states. But what we're talking about here is solid hydrocarbon called Kuragin that's contained in the Green River Formation, which historically has been referred to oil shale. So we have a rock with a solid hydrocarbon in it called Kuragin. And in order to produce that Kuragin, to convert it to oil, we require heating of the rock, either done underground, which is called in situ, or we mine it, bring it to the surface, and run it through a process to heat it up, and that would be an ex situ process. Now, the largest deposits of oil shale in the world, by far, and the highest grades are found in the Piceance Creek Basin of western Colorado, the Uintah Basin of eastern Utah, and the basins in southern part of Wyoming. But the richest deposits are in western Colorado, right here in eastern Utah, and we've known about them for 100 years, and we've tried to develop in the past. So a little bit of the history, besides the fact that we've known about it for 100 years, those of us who have been working in this industry, like myself, for nearly 45 years. I started on the White River Shale project south of Vernal in 1974 on exploration, drilling, and development, rock mechanics. I did geophysical logging out there. Company I was working for designed the mine, which was subsequently built down there and still standing down there if you have an opportunity to go down. The old White River Shale project was constructed in the early 1980s and halted in 1985 when the price of oil declined. So we've gone through a series of boom and busts in this country with the oil shale activity. I mentioned the 1912 to 1920 boom period. 1940s during World War II, the U.S. Bureau of Mines constructed a facility at Rifle, Colorado, the Anvil Points facility, and there was a lot of research and development work going on at that period in time. Then in the early 1970s with the oil embargo, there was another wave of activity. We thought we were running out of oil. We were being held hostage by Iraq and Iran and the Middle Eastern countries, and we had those long fuel lines. And so the Synthetic Fuels Corporation was set up in the 1970s by the government to help develop unconventional fuels such as oil shale. There was a big boom in 1975, 76. That's when the government issued the prototype oil shale leases, two of them in Utah, the UA and UB tracts. That's where the White River Shale mine was built. So the White River Shale project was going to be a 50,000 barrel per day oil shale plant just south of White River. And when the price of oil declined in the 1980s, Synthetic Fuels Corporation was disbanded and that project was shut down. So we've had a series of boom and busts with this industry, never seeming to get it off the ground. We just about get it there, and then the price of oil declines and these projects become uneconomic. So we went through this again recently. In 2005, the Energy Policy Act was passed. And the Energy Policy Act set up a task force to look at development of unconventional fuels, including oil shale. So there was a Section 369 of the Energy Policy Act called for the development of unconventional fuels, including oil sands and oil shale. So they set up a task force and it came out with its final report in 2007 with recommendations for oil shale development. One of the goals out of that report was that they'd be producing 2.5 million barrels per day of shale oil by 2035. So that report came out in 2007, things were rolling ahead, and lo and behold, there was an election in 2008. And so from 2008 through 2016, those recommendations sat idle. The act, the Energy Policy Act of 2005 is still on the books. So what we're in the process of doing is to go back to the National Oil Shale Association and say, you know, what can we do to keep that act alive? You know, after the Energy Policy Act was passed in 2005, we had a resurgence of activity here in the western states on oil shale and oil sands. Many of the major oil companies were back working in Colorado, some here in Utah, Total, Chevron, Exxon, Shale. These companies were all active between 2005 and up through 2012, 2013. At this point in time, every one of the major oil companies pulled back out of Colorado. Every one of those projects has been idled. Total recently pulled out of Utah as well as Colorado. So we're at a period where we're losing our momentum again, mainly because of the low price of oil. Shale oil development became uneconomic. And one of the problems we have with shale oil development, it's a capital-intensive, long lead time project, especially if you're looking at an ex situ process where we have to build a multi-billion-dollar plant. The lead time for the engineering, permitting, the construction is somewhere between 10 and 15 years before we get it operational. And nobody can tell me what the price of oil is going to be out 10, 15 years from now. So the difficulty becomes trying to get investors to commit to these programs. So what we're doing is looking at a new approach to this. Well, let me just state now, so some of you may not even know what shales I'm talking about, but this is the Green River formations of Colorado, western Colorado, the Piceance Creek Basin. Of course, the Uintah Basin is huge, and the Green River formations up in Wyoming as well. But that resource is huge. It's been known for years. This tells us something about the size of the resource. U.S. Geological Survey estimates that there are 1.1 trillion barrels recoverable of shale oil in western Colorado, eastern Utah, and southern Wyoming. That's equivalent to the world's known resources of conventional oil today. I mean, that's, if you really think about it, that's huge. And what we're looking at doing on these projects, if we get one of these projects built in western states, let's say here in the Uintah Basin, a 50,000 barrel per day oil shale plant is a $5 billion to $6 billion investment. But what happens with these projects, they'll employ, we always figure that it'll take 25, each employee will produce 25 barrels per day on average. It means that a 50,000 barrel per day plant would have 2,000 employees. And those 2,000 employees at one of these oil shale plants, that plant would operate for 30 to 40 years at the same location. So what it does, it represents for a community like Vernal's a huge unemployment opportunity, stable employment, extremely high-paying jobs for a long period of time. And that's what the communities here in the West need. I mean, we've gone through these boom and bust cycles, and we're trying to figure out how to avoid doing that again, though. So this is the activity today. Now, as I said, most of these majors have pulled out because of federal government constraints, and which has been one of the major obstacles. And then, of course, the price of oil, uncertainty, the risk involved in the capital investment of these new projects. We still have a few active projects here in Utah. Of course, Red Leaf Resources is active, Benefit American Oil, Dragon, Tomco Energy, QMAST, excuse me, and Great Western Energies. These are some of the projects that are still moving forward. Most of them are smaller companies, entrepreneurial type companies. And then we also have Shale Tech over in Rifle, Colorado, which has got a technology that's been proven, and another company called Independent Energy Partners that's working on a way to heat shale underground using chemical fuel cells. So what we're looking at with this new opportunity, as we called it, I do have copies available up here. I've got a box full of what we've prepared. It's called our white paper. And what we're trying to do is get the new administration to include oil shale as part of the all of the above energy policy that they talk about. Is with this huge elephant we have in the region, we can't even seem to get people to talk about it right now, but we're bringing it back onto the screen. We're trying to make the part of the Trump administration's all of the above energy policy. We want to go back and revisit that 2005 Energy Policy Act, create an oil shale advisory board. That's part of our recommendations in the white paper. And that we also recommend that oil shale be considered part of the National Strategic Oil Shale Reserve concept, which is similar to our National Petroleum Reserves. But if we could show how that we as a nation can produce shale oil here in the western states and get it as part of our reserves or national resources, it would make a great stride in being able to dissuade other people to cut off petroleum resources or imports to the United States, so we can actually get it up and produce our own here in this country. So we're supporting a congressional and administrative energy policy goals. We want to look at helping to make the U.S. energy independent, get it part of our all of the above energy resources. And as I said, one of the current administration's goal is to increase job opportunities here in the United States. And that's one of the things that shale oil would do, not only short-term jobs, but long-term employment with high-paying jobs. And also, in the past, when we developed and produced shale oil in Colorado in the 1970s, early 80s, we took some of that shale oil, from the Parahoe plant, shipped it to Toledo, Ohio, had it changed into, refined into jet fuels and military fuels. And military U.S. Navy jets flew on a jet fuel derived from shale oil. And the reports were remarkable about the quality of the oil, the jet fuel. They were getting more miles out of a tank of fuel, something like 5 to 7% more miles per tank. So the pilots flying off those aircraft carriers were tickled to death to have jet fuel on. They knew they were going to make it back home. And it also burned cleaner. The trouble is, with the Department of Defense, we don't have a supply of it today. It's one of the things we're trying to get back to, is that the Department of Defense is looking for a battlefield fuel. In other words, something that would run in all their tanks, all their military jeeps and planes and helicopters, one fuel. If you think about what's going on in the Middle East, the logistics of trying to supply those different fuels, whether it's gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, to the military, the logistics are horrific. So we're trying to get the DOD back into it and expand leasing of federal lands, as it's been mentioned today. During the 2005 Energy Policy Act and the recommendations that came out in 2007, it called for a federal oil shale leasing program, commercial leasing. And other than a few R&D leases, we're still held up. It makes it difficult for the major oil companies to think about developing a shale project when 70% of the land is is controlled by the federal government, and it's not for lease. So there's only a very small parcels of oil shale in Colorado, the few here in Utah that are privately owned. Federal government controls it all, and they're basically not leasing, not open for business. Now, we're hoping that changes under the new administration. So EPACT 2005 still is in effect, but it wasn't implemented by the past administration, none of the recommendations that came out of the task force. That program, the 2007 recommendations was, like I said, in the case of oil shale, they recommended 2.5 million barrels per day of production by 2035, and that program's totally dead. So where we're at is we're recommending in this white paper, in the white paper we've prepared, we're recommending that Congress go back and set up an oil shale advisory panel to revisit the 2007 recommendations. The National Oil Shale Association has volunteered to take the lead on that, and we had a meeting in August of this year with the subcommittee on Energy and Minerals Resources, which Andrew spoke to. He's the head of that staff organization, one of the speakers here today from Washington. We met with his staff, and of course we're trying to work this process up. You start with the subcommittee, and you get the subcommittee to recommend to the full committee, which is chaired by Rob Bishop of Utah. So the goal is to get authorization to proceed at least with this oil shale advisory panel that would go back and look at the 2007 recommendations and update those for the current climate. We don't believe today, even in the National Oil Shale Association, that the 2.5 million barrels per day by 2035 is even reasonable. The world has changed. The price of oil has dropped. Things are changed. So our approach is to look at what should we be doing in this current climate. And what our focus is on, and it's kind of like U.S. Oil Sands is doing. They talk about their demonstration phase project. In the past, it's been boom and bust because the major oil companies would come in. They say they want a 50,000, 100,000 barrel per day project, and it's a boom and bust. So they're in here spending, and they did in the 70s, they spent billions of dollars going ahead with projects like that Battlement Mason community over in Rifle, and there was a huge amount of activity. And a lot of it was poorly planned out. The technologies weren't proven or weren't well understood. But the oil companies thought they could throw money at it and it would happen. So what we're looking at today, and our recommendations that will probably come out of this advisory board, is that we look at in seeing oil shale develop over time. Industry's approach today is, our association is, let's take it slow and easy this time. Let's build some pilot plants. Let's build some demonstration plants. Let's answer the environmental questions. Let's answer the questions about water needs. Let's answer questions about technology. We've got to start at a small scale. Now, there's things that are advancing in technology that have never been tried yet in production of shale oil. Some of the old proven technology we know will work, but we need to be able to build some plants that investors and the major oil companies can come over and look at, kick the tires, convince themselves that the technology will work. So what we're looking for, is some government cooperation. What we're looking at, and it'll probably come out of this advisory panel, is that we're looking at industry, government cooperation in building some demonstration plants here in the western states where we got a chance to slowly develop it. We avoid these boom and bust periods. We make the public aware of what oil shale's all about. It's not this big spooky thing that's going to be out there that's going to destroy the environment and disrupt our way of life. We talk about a shale project of that 50,000 barrels per day. If it's employing 2,000 permanent employees, it's going to peak at over 3,500 during construction periods. That's going to have a huge impact on places in the West, and none of us want to see that happen and then just see these projects shut down again. So we're intent on trying to do it right. We're with the white paper that went, that we're working our way up back through Congress. We're hoping to get that move forward. And we also would like, support of the states of Colorado, Utah, the local counties to get behind us in this effort, because we think it's good for the western states. The resource is huge. I mean, it's by far the largest and the richest anywhere in the world. And we ought to be doing something to move it forward. You could say, well, we got all this oil right now and the prices are low. Well, now's the time to do it. When prices are low and we're not in a crisis situation, it makes sense to develop it in a systematic, slow, methodical approach. And that's what we're proposing now to Congress is let's take a look at this again. The resource is too big to just be overlooked. Let's get it in position when we need it. It won't be such a scary deal. We'll know that we can get the investors behind it, the industry behind it, and take a long-term approach to developing this industry. So that's kind of where we're at. Copies of the white paper, some of you will find those of interest. We'd encourage you to look at joining the National Oil Shale Association. Our website's out there, www.oilshaleassociation.org, and we have our white paper posted there as well. But one of the things that some of you recall, Representative Jim Hansen of Utah. About 10 years ago, I met with Jim Hansen. He was then the chairman of the House Committee on Natural Resources. And I had dinner with Jim down in Salt Lake City, and I was working as vice president of oil shale exploration at the time. And we were talking about oil shale, and he made this profound statement at the time that he said, Gary, oil shale's not going to happen until the federal government wants it to happen. And that set me back on my heels as an industry guy. I had this idea that we could do it because I've worked in the mining industry for 45 years. And, but as time has passed and where I sit today, I've come to the realization that if the federal government doesn't want it to happen, it probably won't. And the reason that is they control the resource, they control the permitting process, they control the right-of-ways, they control so much of what we do in this industry that if they don't want it to happen, if they won't lease the land, if they won't issue the permits, if they won't issue the right-of-ways, they can stop us any place along the way. And that's why we're taking this methodical approach that let's do it on a slow development path, get us to where we want to be. And I think in the long run, it'll create an industry here in the West that we'll be proud of and it'll create employment, high-paying jobs, lots and lots of tax revenues for the local counties and the state. Thank you.